Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a difficult moment for me to be here, but we're here to honor the life of George Pérez. George is, I'm sure as many of you know, George is not only one of the most legendary creators that have ever graced this industry, but he's also one of the greatest human beings I've ever had the privilege of knowing. Today we're here to remember him and to celebrate his life and share how much he meant to us and how much he meant to his fans and how much he touched us not only as a creator, but as a person. So we're just going to kick this off, and I'm going to introduce some folks that they're going to join us on the panel, and we'll go from there. So the first person I would like to introduce is Dan Jurgens. Dan Jurgens, please come on up. Dan and George not only worked together multiple times, but they were friends. And it was, Dan was going to be at the show, and I knew he had to be on this panel. So thank you, Dan, for joining us. Thank
of course.
You. Next, I'm going to have Dan DiDio. Dan DiDio, please step up. Dan, of course, worked with George on numerous projects and also a very dear friend of George. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dan. Next, I'm going to bring up Constance. Constance, what can I say about Constance in relation to
you can thank her for the slideshow.
That's first. I do not. My slideshow did not work, and Constance brought a slideshow for George's memorial that they did down in MegaCon. So without Constance, we would not have a slideshow. So thank you, Constance.
There you go.
But beyond that, Constance was a very loyal and dear friend to George and Carol, and took care of him in ways that everyone who loved George can't thank her enough for. She was there for him in good times and in bad times, and I cannot thank you for enough for doing all that you did for him. So thank you. Next, we got Alex. Yeah, Alex, please come on up. Alex has a lot of great influences with George, and he wants to talk about how George had touched him in so many ways over the years and influenced his work, and we're going to talk a little bit of that. So we also have Phil Jimenez. Phil will return in just a little bit, and he'll join us when he gets back. So we got the slideshow running. We got a lot of great, as I'm talking, definitely read the wonderful, amazing comments that are on the screen by George's friends and fans. There's a lot of touching stuff there, and I'm going to do my best to keep it together. So, George's contribution to the industry is beyond measurement. Starting back in the day, young kid back in the Bronx, if I remember. Was the Bronx he was from, Constance? Yeah. Starting work with Marvel early on, and then getting bigger and bigger projects, and finally getting a name for himself, and then eventually working on some of the biggest projects of all time. Projects that not only are amazing in how that they were at the time, they were groundbreaking, but also stuff that will easily withstand the test of time. George put his heart and soul into every pencil stroke. Every pencil stroke. It didn't matter if he was doing something on the page for a big crossover event, or if he was doing something for a fan that was at a convention. George always put his heart and soul into every piece of art that he ever did. And not only beyond his art, I think we sometimes forget that George was a great storyteller as well. And for me, the very definition of the character of Wonder Woman is the way that George had written and drew her. So I think we forget that sometimes, that George was also a great writer and had such amazing ideas. That's such a great picture. Beyond that, George was a tremendous human being. There is not a person who did not meet George Pérez who did not instantly fall in love with the man. He made you feel warm. He made you feel warm. From the moment that you met him, he made you feel comfortable. He made you feel like you had known him your entire life. And his rapport with the fans was beyond reproach. One of my favorite things to watch happen at the conventions when George would come, not only to read pop conventions, but any conventions I would see him at. He would hold court. He would draw at his table, and the fans would surround him, and they'd just listen to his stories, and such amazing stories, and not only necessarily industry stories, just stories about his life. George had a very interesting life, and he had a lot of great adventures, and he had a lot of great friends, and he would love to tell his adventures, and people would just sit around and just eat every second of it up. So beyond that, I cannot continue without stressing the relationship he had with his beautiful wife, Carol. George and Carol had what we would define as a true love. How many years were they married, Constance? I know he used to count it in months. How many years was it? It was a long time. George used to count the months. Every month he would celebrate his anniversary, as it were, with Carol, where we've been married, I am making up a number, 328 months or whatever it was. He would always celebrate the months because he loved her so deeply. And seeing them together was just magical. They had a true love story. And I'm glad that they got to live that life together, because watching them was inspiring, because that's the life that everybody wants to lead. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself real quick. My name is Mike Nagan, for you who don't know. I take care of Artist Alley and the comic book creators here at the Read Pop shows. My very first comic when I was a kid was New Teen Titans #1, August 1980, if I remember correctly. I was a troubled kid, couldn't read, getting into a lot of trouble at school. And the teacher recommended that I start reading comics to my mother, and next thing I know, I had New Teen Titans in my hand, and it changed me. I looked at that book and the art and the story, and I felt like I could connect with that story, and it set me on a path that led me here today, to the career I had, to the life I had. Me and George would often joke every time we had dinner. I would say, George, I have you to owe for this life. I don't know whether to thank you or to blame you. And he would laugh. So for me, now that he was my idol as a child, and well into my younger years, and then I got into the industry doing conventions, and I had met him as a fan. The very first time I had met him as a fan, I literally could not speak. I was stammering, couldn't get a word out, and he was very kind and patient with me. And then we became friends through the shows, and then eventually I started working in the industry, and then we became really, really dear friends. And I just never imagined that my childhood hero would one day be a close dear friend. And it really was a dream. And I cherish every moment that I got to spend. So, I think I've spoken enough at this point. I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to start with Dan. Dan, tell us a little bit about what you want to share with your relationship with George, and how you met and how you guys, came to be his friends.
Well, we got to be friends fairly early when I started, like the early 80s. And at that time, we never even really worked together too much. I did some Titans work when George was unable to do so, did a little bit of that. And then later, we worked together several times. George wrote some Superman stuff that I drew. I drew stuff that he inked. I never got to write for George, which is odd and had him draw anything that I wrote. But we worked as penciler and inker, and we worked as writer and penciler with him doing the writing. So that was always fun, and it was enjoyable just because of George's visual language that he had in his style of writing. But I think what I always was so impressed by was the way George comported himself, and you addressed this earlier, with his fans. And the way he would show up at conventions, often sitting at the Hero Initiative booth, where he would just sit there for hour after hour after hour, signing and sketching, and with this total commitment to that as a cause, and this idea that everybody who came to see him was going to get something. That if there were 300 people, and I swear it certainly, the lines would hit that long at times, that if there were 300 people there, everyone was going to get a little doodle or a sketch or something from George, and they then responded to his charity by expressing their own with regards to the Hero Initiative, which was so important to George. And just watching the way he handled himself with his fans and the people who came to see him, and as Mike alluded to, made everyone feel at home around him. I mean, if we should all be so gracious with those who come to see us and come to listen to what we have to say, George was absolutely without peer in that department. And just the way he handled himself, it was authentic too. There are those who can kind of put that on and adopt the right face, but with George, that was 100% authentic. And it was always a marvel to watch, because I know there were more than a couple of times that I would walk up to him after one of those long stretches at the table and I'd say, I don't know how you do it. And he would kind of gesture to everybody and say, because it's for them, and everyone would then give him the round of applause. But that really is who George was, and certainly how I think of him.
Thanks, Dan. That's definitely, you said a word to me that really, really defines George in that way. Gracious. George defined graciousness.
Yeah.
Dan, I'm gonna ask you to share a little bit about your relationship with George.
It's funny because Constance and I, we did a panel back right after he passed, and it was pretty raw at that time too, pretty raw. And I go back and I try to think about, trying to remember when I first met George, or my first reaction, and honestly, I can't remember my first meeting. I can't remember my first meeting, because in some ways you have people that you feel that's always been in your life, and I've always known his work. I've always followed his work. I always loved his work. So I felt like, as a fan, you create this, like, the people just because you know their work and you feel that connection to them, even though you've never met. And for years, while I was working outside of comics and TV, I'd worked with Marv Wolfman. So I knew Marv. So Marv and I would talk about George all the time. We'd always talk about George. This has been the books they did together and all this. And, I have to admit, I hired Marv because I wanted to talk comics with him. I mean, honestly, in animation, I hired him to be an animation writer because I wanted to talk comics with him, and I had a great time. So I always did it. And I think when I started at DC, he might have been exclusive to CrossGen or some other company at the time, and he wasn't at DC. So because of that, I still knew him because of all the work he did, surrounded us everywhere at DC. And of course, I'm working with Phil Jimenez, who is the living embodiment of everything that George stood for at DC at the time. So he was always there. So when I meet him, it's almost anticlimactic. So I can't remember in a weird way. But I do remember the first work with him. Okay? The first work. So the first work we do with him is we're doing Infinite Crisis. Right, and I'm looking at Phil. We're doing Infinite Crisis, and we put these ridiculous schedules on Phil. And Phil, much like George, wants every single character on every single page in every single correct proportion in every way possible. And the schedule starts to collapse. And we're looking, and the brainstorm is, who can help us? And the person who helps us is George Perez. And he doesn't come in to be the star. He doesn't come in to make it look he's triumphant. He didn't want his name to be the prominent name on the book. He came in because he wanted to help and be part of it, and he didn't compromise a bit. He didn't cut a corner. He didn't do anything. He just was George Perez, and that's who he was. That love of comics drove his choices, not about anything other than that. And I think that might be the first time I met him, but not the last, which is wonderful. And, you know, you always have these careers that just move in and out of each other. And anytime you meet George, you always pick up where you left off. There's never a bad word. There's never an ill feeling. Even if there was things that didn't work out, it was always about happy to see you, happy to be involved. What else can I do? And so there's always memory. So it's even when we do these panels now, it's like, isn't he still here? You know, is he still around? I see him every day. I see him in my books. I see him in the statues. I see every character. So while we lament the loss of the person, you know, the legacy will always be with us. And it's good to do things like this. But for my memories, I'll always have that memory, and he'll always be with me too.
Thank you. Constance.
It was 490 months.
490 months.
Yeah. 40.8 years.
Wow.
A true love story.
Very much. I love George's work, but I was very lucky to also love George and know George. And I was just looking at that, and there's a picture in there of him holding my son for the first time. And my son loved George, like adored him. And he's 2.5. So he asks me, George, Bill Sienkiewicz did a beautiful piece when George passed away. And it belongs to Carol. And when Bill sent it to me, he sent a head sketch that he had done of George that I've put in my son's room. And my son looks at it and he says, "There's George."
Mm-hmm.
And that brings me a lot of joy, but it also kind of, you know, a little punch in the gut there. But I can't tell you about his volumes of work or what it was like to work with him or watch him create. But I can tell you, how many of you met George ever? Even for a minute? He loved you. He loved you. And he never met a stranger. And for those of you who didn't meet him and are here because you're fans of his work, he loved you with his whole heart. There was no distinction between his family and these fans that he adored. It was all genuine. None of it was him being on. He loved his life, and he was so grateful to all of you for that life. You have no idea the joy you all brought him. Even in his final days, the joy you brought him. Even when he was feeling low, the joy you brought him. When he had his heart attack in 2017? 17?
Yeah, I think it's sweet.
He was so upset because, I mean, he'd had a heart attack, so he wasn't thrilled, but he was so upset that I was like, yeah, you can't come to MegaCon, George. You have to stay home for this one. And he was so upset. He said, but my fans, they're going to worry. And I want to see them, and it will make me happy. And he loved all of you. It's true. Everything that you ever heard him say in an interview or everything that he ever said to you at a convention, it was true. And he went through those lines of 300 people. Mm-hmm. He went through them like they were nothing. In 2017 or 2018, when he went back to doing conventions, Carol put her foot down and said, "You have to make him leave the table to eat." And then George put his foot down and said, "I'm not leaving the table. And I'm just standing there with a hot dog and a Diet Coke." So, which we compromised, and he ate at the table.
I can commiserate with you that.
Yeah, I figured you might. He was the very definition of love and joy. And we're so lucky to have had him even for a little while. And it's hard, right? Because it hurts. It's hard to stop and think about how lucky we actually were that we knew this incredible person, because it hurts. But we were very lucky. And like Dan said, he's still here everywhere. And every single one of you that's thinking about your interactions with him or your favorite work with him or that time that he greeted you like you were a long lost friend when you came up in his line as one of 300 people. That's a conservative estimate, by the way.
Yes.
He meant it. He loved with his whole heart, with complete reckless abandon, like he would never run out of love. And he didn't. So thank you, all of you, for what you gave him, because I was there to see it. And it made things better for him, knowing how much all of you loved him. It really did. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for everything that you guys gave him.
Alex, you want to share a little bit of your thoughts on George?
Yeah, I mean, my experience with George is a little different than my fellow panelists. I didn't have the joy of having a close friendship with him, but like Constance was saying, every time you interacted with him, he treated you like you were family. For me, it was as a fan, as a Cuban American kid in Miami who wanted to work in comics. I can't overstate the value of seeing people like you succeed, like George or Phil. And knowing that there's a path forward and that you can achieve your dreams. And that was professionally like how I saw George. And eventually I got to work at DC right around that era that Dan was talking about with, Infinite Crisis and Legion of Three Worlds. And I remember George was just the height of graciousness. We at DC Publicity, we would run you through the gauntlet of interviews, basically. We would have you stand there and have everyone run by and ask you the same 5 questions and kind of, it was a little mind-numbing. But the one that was always smiling was George. And I remember one moment vividly that I think I screwed up the order of the interviews, or it was a mistake. And I felt bad that, I was wasting his time. And he just kind of took my hand and said, it's fine. It's no big deal. And I think you learn things about people as you watch them professionally, but I also learned a lot from him in those small moments that, it's not just doing the work, it's how you do the work and how you engage with people and you kind of give the kindness back. And so that's something that sits with me to this day. Like everyone's saying, he's gone, but he's not really gone. So.
Thanks, Alex. By the way, Phil Jimenez. Jared joined us a little bit late, but I wanted to introduce him. Phil had a long working relationship with George, but also was a very dear friend. And obviously there's nobody probably in the world more influenced, whose work is more influenced than Phil's work by George. So Phil, please share.
I'm sorry I'm late. One thing that George and I share also is I'm diabetic, so I had to go drink some juice before I did this little panel, which is actually really funny. George and I had a lot in common. I'm not going to say that we were close because we weren't. Wow. And I think that was probably by design. A couple quick things. So for those of you who don't know me, George was without doubt the single most impactful influence on my career, my decision to draw comics, and the way I draw comics. I got into comics wanting to draw like George Pérez. A lot of artists have influences and then ultimately evolve into something else. And I actually was never really interested in that. Like George, the sort of comics that George created were really important to me. And his approach to art, his approach to narrative was singular, as we all know. And it became sort of my mission in life to perpetuate a tradition, the sort of, which I felt was not happening in comics, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, as people sort of veered into a different artistic style. I decided when I was young, it was gonna be my mission in life to perpetuate the George Pérez way of working. Mind you, this was not George Pérez's idea. I think about this a lot. Like, I don't think George ever wanted or asked for this, but he was just, he was kind enough to let me do it. And I think I mean, really couldn't stop me, I guess. So anyway, so I got into comics drawing like George Perez, and I was really great. I was really happy to do that. Because hilariously, I was like anyone that copies someone else. I could never quite do George. So mine was, so everything was often a little off. Very quick, so I'm veering, just a couple of funny quick stories. One, the first time I actually met George Perez was in 1989. I had just moved to New York City. I was bound and determined to work for DC Comics. I'd established a relationship with Karen Berger, who was the then editor of Wonder Woman. And for reasons she still says she doesn't understand, she let me come to the offices to visit her, and she was gonna give me a Wonder Woman script to work from. And she greeted me back when DC Comics was at 666 Fifth Avenue. And I get in the elevator with her and this other man, and we go up, and she didn't realize who I was at the time. Then she meets me at the front desk, and she apologizes because she had to cancel our meeting because someone else was there. And who else was in the elevator but George Perez, which was hilarious. It was actually the first time I'd ever seen him, but I didn't know who he was because back in the day, late 80s, there just wasn't a lot of imagery. I just didn't have access to imagery. So the first time I met him was riding an elevator with him, and neither of us knew who the other was. And it was basically to talk to George, to talk to Karen Berger to get a script from him so I could practice, which she gave me. And it was those pages that I used ultimately as a portfolio to get my first work from DC Comics. And then, of course, I started at DC Comics. My first job there was doing 4 pages of pencils over George Perez layouts on War of the Gods, his ill-fated Wonder Woman 50th anniversary issue. So I got into comics being a George Perez fan, drawing like George, working on a George Perez crossover with Wonder Woman, which was pretty terrific. Just a couple of other quick stories, not to dominate. I first actually met George. We were nominated for Eisner's the same year. Strangely, I was nominated for penciler, he was nominated for inker. And it was, I mentioned this in San Diego, it was the first time he called me son, which meant a lot. And he sort of hooted and hollered. I don't remember if he won, because he was inking Dan on Titans, which is actually really funny. And I had gotten a Best Penciler nomination for Tempest. Soon after, we ended up going for a walk at this particular convention. And I was shocked to find out how much I actually had in common with him. Again, we were never close. We were never particularly good friends. I think there was quite a bit of professional distance between us, and that was great. But we found out we were diabetic. We found out we were taking ballroom dancing lessons. We found out our sensibilities were shaped by very similar things, including having mothers we wanted to impress. And that was something I actually really, really appreciated about him. The other couple of funny stories, I remember when he was working on JLA Avengers, and he called me up out of the blue to tell me how happy he was about my version of Themyscira, because that was the ultimate culmination of, that was exactly what he would have wanted for those characters when he left that book. I was like, that's terrific. And then finally, hopefully you all find this funny story, is when he got sick, I decided I was gonna have my Tuesdays with Maury moments with George, and because I'd been out of touch with him for many years. I started calling him like every Tuesday or every other Tuesday. And then I realized about 2 Tuesdays in, he didn't really care. So I'm like just trying to chat him up and find out all the stuff about his life. And I mean, he's incredibly gracious because he's George. But there was something really, really funny about the fact that I don't know what I wanted. I had some wonderful conversations with him. But at some point it's like, okay, I get it. It's maybe not every Tuesday, maybe every 3rd Tuesday will be enough. But our last conversation I love because it was completely awkward. It was a disaster. I had been inking his original JLA Avengers 83 pages on Procreate and was really excited, but I was really studying his drawing and was stunned at how exponentially better he got between those pages and Crisis on Infinite Earths, which were only about 2 years. And so because he's still George and he still makes me nervous because he's, you know, my art guy, I was just like, so George, like what happened on those JLA Avengers pages? Somehow I phrased it in a way where he got really defensive. And he was just like, well, you know, I was only this old and I you know, I was still learning and I know they're a little stiff and whatever. And I'm like, George, no, like I love this shit. Like this is amazing. Like that's not what I mean. Like I just, like there was a period where just 2 years, you got so good. And I was just curious what happened. But of course I'm not phrasing it. I'm getting more and more nervous. He's just like, why are you calling me? I was just like, and then we got in some other conversation about representation and being like sort of representative of a group, and we totally had different feelings about it. And then he was like called to dinner. I'm like, thank God. I'll talk to you later, George. And that was my last conversation with George Perez. But it was it was a good one, I think.
He loves you.
Oh, it's great. I just love like, no, George. That's not what I meant. It's just very funny.
Thanks, Bill. I love the funny stories. George was a very humorous man. He definitely had a lot of fun adventures with him in my time. For me personally, one of the things that always sticks out is when I first entered this industry to start working doing conventions. Of course, I'm given a budget. And like every of these things, you probably don't know how these things work, but you're given a budget for guests that you can bring in. So I'm just newly empowered. I get all this money. Who am I bringing in? I'm gonna bring in George Perez. The first thing that I get, this is my wish list. The first person I bring in is George Perez, and I bring in George and Marv actually for one of the very early C2E2s, 2011, I want to say. And I was like saying, it was Christmas for me. I got to pick what toys I wanted. I want George, I want Marv, and they came down. And again, you know, I was like a kid in the candy store that they sat next to each other, and I got to spend time with him. So I had to walk George to a panel, and me and George and I. This is the first time I'm in the convention center, and anyone who's ever been to the McCormick Place in Chicago, it's 5 times bigger than the Javits Center. 5 times. And I had never been there before, and I had to walk to George to a panel. And we got terribly lost. Terribly lost. To the point where we're walking, and then we start to get into these conversations and you know, I'm a comic nerd, so I'm asking all these crazy questions like, you know, how'd you feel about Hal Jordan not being in Crisis on Infinite Earths and all these, you know, nitpicky crazy things. And we just started talking and laughing, and all of a sudden we realized we'd probably been walking for like over an hour. We totally missed the panel. Totally, completely missed the panel. I was able to reschedule it. Thankfully, we were able to get the fans to see him, but we got just lost in the bowels of the convention center and had like, to me, like this perfect funny moment, and it was just so great. So, Dan, you have any funny stories of George you want to share?
Yeah. So, okay, I was probably there was a point where did you guys all read Teen Titans for the most part? Okay, right. So there was a point where DC decided they were going to do kind of a dual edition thing, and they started the Baxter book, which I think was just called Titans.
No, it's called New Teen Titans.
Just Titans, right?
Titans.
And George had done, I think, either the first 4 or 5 issues, and then it had fallen off schedule, and they needed someone to come in and draw one. So they I think it was Marv that called me up and asked me to do it. So I said, well, you know, you don't necessarily just want to jump in and follow George Perez, and he was only taking 1 issue off. But I said, okay, I'll do it. So Marv writes this plot, and it came in, and there was a double-page spread on pages 2 and 3. And Marv wrote in the plot, Titans getting a ticker tape parade down through Times Square with so much detail it would, quote, this is the exact quote, make George Perez jealous. And I sat there looking at this thing, and I just said, I can't do that. Nobody can do that. What are you thinking? And anyway, so I did the best I could, which was not at all anywhere near what George would have done with it. And then a couple of months later, Marv and George and I and a couple others were at dinner someplace, and I started talking about this story. And so George is hearing that for the first time because he had not seen the plot. And he just started climbing all over Marv for doing that to someone. You should never do that. You can't ask another artist to draw like another, you know, that whole kind of thing. And I just sat there going, yeah, thank you, George. Yeah, you just lay it out there. Yeah, and that was great because George stuck up for me, which I appreciated very much. And to this day, I still can't do anything with enough detail that would have made George jealous. So.
question. I know if this was your experience with him, one thing I actually loved about George is when he got angry, he would talk about himself in the third person. He'd be like, George Pérez will not sit still for this. Like, he will not stand for this.
Yeah.
And it always used to make me laugh because at some point we were talking about something, I think it was Infinite Crisis related. And he goes, George Pérez does not work this way.
Well, there was another one, and the other part of it is, so at one point, George was writing Adventures of Superman and I was drawing it. And so the problem is, when you work with someone who is also an artist, when you read their plots, you kind of visualize it as though they were going to draw it. So once again, I'm sitting there looking at the material as it was coming in, and I'm trying not to be George. I want to be me, but then I didn't want to let George down. So I think I had done like 10 pages and sent them in, and everyone at the office was like, okay, cool, and everything. And I thought, I still haven't heard from George. And so I'm wondering, does that mean he doesn't like it? And then I thought, well, I should probably call him up and ask him, but if he doesn't like it, do I want to know? But finally, I gave him a call, and he was remarkably reassuring about it. And he said, no, you don't understand. I don't want it to look like me. I want you to do you. And he was so good about that. And that's what always made him so good to work with. And so even later, when I was penciling and he was inking, I always think when it comes to inking that that's when you see someone's personality come through in their work, more so than in penciling. And not to do too much of a deep dive here, but they're cold pencilers and somehow their work is very austere and it doesn't come through. George's level of detail and kind of that little noodliness that he puts in his inking work, I think that's kind of his personality and the level of caring. There's something emotional about his ink line. I hope this makes sense. I see you guys shaking your head, and that helps. There's something about his ink line that I thought his personality came through in, and he really brought a warmth to my work when he inked it. And I really, truly appreciated that. And I always treasured him, whether it was on the Titan stuff or Green Arrow, which we did later. And he was just a phenomenal collaborator because he would give you as another creator room to be you.
Hey, Dan, do you have a humorous story you'd like to share?
Yeah, I don't have these anecdotes. I'm glad I don't have that story about the phone call. Wow, that's pretty good. I can see that actually happening, which is great. Yeah, it's because God knows I've had enough of those with other people, just not George. But it's for me, I think back special moments with George, and my special moment with George was actually giving the ability to finish a project that he wanted to finish, which was Titans Games. And this was a book, I don't know how long it languished at DC, and it just sat there. And there's nothing worse when you're in a company that's out putting out books that you see something completely beautiful that people will want, and it's unfinished and everybody had given up on it and they weren't going to get to it. And I talked to Marv about it and I talked to George about it, and you could tell from George this was an itch. He had to get this thing done. It was something that bothered him, that it was started and never finished, and they kept on going to me. And they kept on saying, oh, but we can't do it. It's done in an old style. It's a different team. And I kept on looking at him like, what? I mean, I'm serious. And they kept on making excuses to me on why I shouldn't do it. And they were trying to explain it to me, and they're trying to explain why I shouldn't do it. And I kept on going, first of all, every one of your books is still in print. Every single one, and they're going to stay in print forever. Those are the things that are evergreens. Like, people are going to buy in and always do it. So that's just silly. And to try to alter, and then they said, well, maybe we'll go in, we'll change the costumes, we'll alter this. But that's who they were, both Marv and George. They were so locked into making the world work and making the world make sense and working with people, which is what it's so essential to say right now, because you work with so many people these days, they're just going to do their version or their style or this thing that they remember when they were kids. And George and Marv had this beautiful body of work, the quintessential version of Teen Titans, and yet they were willing to change work that they did 20 years earlier to match other people's work today. And I said, no. I said, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to go back and draw, because look how long it took us to get this thing done. You're going to waste all time going backwards. And second thing is, this is a beautiful compendium work that matches everything you've done earlier. It's a nice addition to your volumes, not something else. So it goes back to one thing that we say, and it's the word, we all use a different word, but my word was selflessness. He was selfless. It really was the work first. You know, the only time I'm trying to think, it's funny, Phil talks about arguments, and the first thing you think about is, oh shit, what did I fight with them about?
It wasn't you.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, I say, I'm like, no, I'm saying, but you know, it's like, oh my gosh, what did I say? And honestly, and it's, anytime that I got into a disagreement with George, it was about story and character, about how the character worked, how it behaved, and I was always in the unenviable position of arguing a character's sensibilities with the guy that created them, you know, which is not a place you want to be ever, especially with the career that he had. So for me, and I'm very happy to say those were very few discussions that occurred like that. But again, it was that selflessness and his constant willing to add and be part of the lore and do that, you know, and from the DC side, I was very glad that so much of what he did was able to, you know, capitalize on and be able to participate in, because him and Marvel were real trailblazers in that sense of what they were doing there, and I was glad it was able to work out for him. And honestly, I think the comics were all better for it. You know.
I just wanted to actually, this is a strange circle back, but piggyback on something that Constance said. In one of our last conversations, it was just going back to him feeling lucky. Like he felt incredibly.
Yes.
Like, we were just saying.
He said that a lot. He said that a lot.
Bullshit. He felt really lucky to do what he did. And that's really interesting in our business, because I'm not sure we all do all the time. I think part of that, not to deep dive too much, has a lot to do with how we now think of a lot of this stuff as IP.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think George ever did.
Never did.
Right. And so but the thing he kept saying over and over was that he told me over the years, was that he wanted to make his mother proud. His mom had a really tough life, and so him being a good person was about tribute to her. But the other thing he just said was he felt really fortunate, like to do the work that he did. Like he really loved the work. Of course, he loved fans and the people. And I just remember thinking, and he loved his wife, right? Like, so it was just like. It was just a really extraordinary, lovely way to live. And it's really, I bring this up just thinking about characters and him, like, George Pérez will not stand for this, you know, that kind of thing. Because it was really funny, like for someone who was genuinely gracious and good, when you would see those flares of anger or whatever, you're like, oh yeah, he could do that too.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Right?
You get used to it from everybody else. So when the person who doesn't do it happens, it really catches you off guard.
But he really felt lucky. And that's a really lovely thing. Yeah.
Constance, I'm sure you have so many stories. We could
I
fill a whole panel.
I don't know how many of them I can just tell. When I don't know if you guys are aware of the amount of work that George put into charity, and not just like the Hero Initiative, and not just Wounded Warriors, which he did in honor of his late father-in-law, but to people as well. And like one of the things, individual people, like there are hundreds of people out there who have stories like, George helped me when I was at my lowest, or George did this thing for me and he helped me. He helped my marriage. He helped I mean, the man just was an endless giver. And it brought him so much joy to do this thing. He did this project. He did Sirens.
Yeah.
And it was a great book. And he had a blast doing it. And he drew all of his friends into Sirens. And then he had this giant signing event where they gave him the key to the city of Sanford and they made it George Pérez Day. And he didn't want to sign. He wanted all of the people that he drew into the book to sign. And he set up this giant signing for all these people who aren't comic book people, like, to sign books. And he stood in line and had us all sign. That's my son.
Yeah.
And had us all sign his book. And he went down the line. And he just had so much joy for that. And it just brought him such glee to do that for people, to give us that moment and that experience. I'll tell you, probably one of the funniest things he ever said to me was, and I apologize if this is a tad dark, but, I happen to be, I live in Florida. Like I grew up right down the road from George and Carol. Like we used to do Christmases together and Christmas Eve. And I happened to be in Manhattan celebrating my graduation when George had his heart attack in New Jersey. So I just happened to be across the river. His wife was in London and called me and said, I don't know what to do. And I was like, I got it. No problem. I'm going. I went to the hotel. I got his stuff. I went to the wrong hospital, and then I went to the right hospital eventually. And I finally get back, and getting into the back of a hospital is not easy. Well, okay, maybe it is easy. You just have to walk like you know what you're doing. So I finally get into the cardiac ICU. I get past all the nurses. I walk into the room, and he looks at me and he goes, "Oh, this cannot be good." Because he didn't have his phone. Yeah. I didn't tell him I was coming. He just looks at me and he goes, "Oh, well, this cannot be anything good." And, why is Constance from Florida showing up in my hospital room in New Jersey?
That's good.
But he just took so much joy from his life. And I'm so happy that he was so happy. And his mom, Phil mentions his mom. His mother is Yoda. Like, yeah. She is a force. We saw her last in January, and she's amazing. And when you meet her, it's a direct line to the person that George always was, and he did make her proud, and she remains proud. And I'm just so glad that I had the chance to have him in my life, and that I have stories like this to share, and stories that I won't share. But I'm just so grateful for the life that he got to have and the joy that he got to bring others. It recharged him, making people happy, making people smile. And I mean, he loved everybody in the industry too. Like, he talked about you all the time, Phil. And Dan, the layout that you did for that memorial piece, he loved. He absolutely was stunned by. You thought you were okay too.
I get a lot of that too.
He adored you. And he just loved everybody.
We got a few more minutes. Alex, do you have some words you want to say? And then
yeah, I mean, for me, it was when I got to DC doing publicity. The best publicists are kind of in the background. You're the ghost behind, the ghost in the machine. You don't get noticed. And I got to kind of absorb so much from so many talented people like Phil and George and Dan and everyone that was creating at DC at that time. But I was kind of middle management at that point. So sometimes your boss would say, "Hey, can you sit here and kind of manage this talent or sit with them for a little bit?" And yeah, and I loved it. I mean, as a fan, like, okay, I'll sit with Denny O'Neil for an hour and just listen to him tell stories. And there was one convention where it was Marv and George sitting at a table, and I just got to be the fly on the wall, just like listening to these people that had worked together for so long and had this great affection for each other. It was around the time, like Dan was saying, when Games was coming out, and to have that, I don't want to call it a victory lap, but it was a victory lap for that series. And to see the outpouring of love and affection from fans of every shape and every era just coming together to celebrate them one more time was fascinating. And to see how they took it. I think for me also, there's creators that you admire and want to emulate their work, but there's also creators that you learn as a person, you want to emulate how they behave and how they act with fans and readers. And that's definitely what I pulled from George. I got to write a White Tiger story for Marvel recently, and I had, I was really, George was heavy on my mind doing that story. And it's just, he just has this amazing legacy that is hard to ignore. And why would you want to? Yeah.
One thing about his legacy, and I was just thinking about this as I was watching these, this is a lot of these images of him are older. And I was thinking about you specifically and him and even me, like, some of the pivotal work we did was when we were young. Yeah. And I just was thinking about some of the most, I'm going to say important, that's perhaps unfair, but some of the most, I would say, pivotal work that he did, the stuff that he's known for, he did in his late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
It is mind-boggling to think of, again, artistically, a point of view, his ability to generate, and to transform an industry at 27, 28. Like, that's extraordinary. And the one thing I hope everyone remembers is is the width and breadth of his career. Again, so many of these images are of him later, but a lot of the stuff he did that we freaking love, he did as basically a kid. Same with you.
Do you know what year he won his Inkpot Award?
I don't.
1983.
Wow.
Makes sense.
That's
He
amazing.
got his Inkpot, which is like massive contribution.
It's
to
huge.
comics.
It's huge.
Like, for those of you who don't know,
Yes.
it's an award that's just, you have created something and contributed to the soul of comics, to this giant thing, and he won it in 1983.
It's like a lifetime achievement.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
lifetime achievement.
yeah.
I think what's also fascinating is his willingness to like be part of the team. Dan, I mean, I remember as a kid reading Titans, and Dan was writing and drawing it, and George was inking it, and I was like, wow, George Perez is inking this book. Like, this is George Perez, who could be, I love that run, but he wanted to just be part of something. He didn't always have to be in the spotlight, and I found that really
Yeah,
fascinating.
actually, he was in a phase where he wanted something on the board in front of him. He said, "I just don't want to see a blank sheet of paper. I want something on the board in front of me." And I think he was going through a bit of a creative change at that point, and some other stuff, and it was just a treat to work with him because. The other part about it is, in seeing all these pictures, I wish there was a picture up there of George, like circa 1980, 82. He looked so different. He had this big, thick mane of black hair. He was really kind of an imposing guy. He was a lot heavier. He was bigger. And it's like, wow, George Perez. Okay. You back up a little bit because George's presence was just so different then. And not that he was trying to be different. It was just very different. It'd be fun to have a couple of those shots in here. Maybe for the next slide show. Yeah.
Maybe for the one that I do, because Constance saved me.
Have lots travel.
We unfortunately got to wrap up but I think we could all agree that we could talk for hours and hours and hours about George. There's more words than we could ever say. I guess my final thought here, and I'd like to ask you guys for your thoughts, but my final thought here is, Constance said something that really struck me, is George felt so lucky for his life. He felt so lucky for his career and for his friends and for his fans and his wife and his family. But I think we were the lucky. We were really the lucky ones because he touched so many people, more than he probably will ever realized. For me, when I was a kid, I had a really dark childhood, and reading Titans every month is sometimes got me through. It got me through that, and we were the lucky ones to have him as part of our lives. Whether you were a fan or a friend, we were the lucky ones. So, then you got any final words?
Me, I would only say this, and because I'm going to bring Neil Adams into this just a bit, and that is because we lost both those guys so close at the same time. And I have always thought, and we'll plant this flag, that Neil was the supreme visualization of what DC Comics was in the 70s. George was that in the 80s. George defined the look of DC Comics in the 80s through Titans, Crisis on Infinite Earths, and virtually anything he did. And it has been said by many others that Marvin George saved the company in the 80s. And to have that kind of a stamp and to make that kind of an impression professionally and then back it up with the way you conduct yourself as a person, which he did, I think is just phenomenal. And George was the 1980s face of DC.
Very true. Dan, you have any final words?
No, I was just going to say, Dan, you were the 90s, so stay with us.
I'll try. I've got no other plan.
Ouch.
I'm watching you.
Oh, shit. It's getting dark, people. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Good one, Dave.
Thank you.
That's a good one, Dan. Do you have anything?
You know, no filter. I don't need a filter anymore, guys.
You had a filter?
No, not really.
That was your filter. Dan, do you have any final words you want to say about George? Any final thoughts? Any final words?
Me?
Dan? Yeah, Dan.
Oh, me still? No, you know what? Honestly, I got a chance to see George in hospice before he passed. And honestly, all I could say is that it was the most upbeat conversation I ever had. Kind of crazy. I didn't know what to do, so I brought a piece of art because I didn't know what to talk about. And I just wanted to show him that I had an art because it was mine and his, and he could care less. Just like he could care less. He just started talking about the day, how he's doing, and what was lunch about. And it was just, and he had the most positive spirit. And I guess that's why for me that everything's like, I don't know. I left him. He seemed fine, you know. And even though you knew his body was giving out, he seemed fine. He was okay. He was good with it. And that's the way I remember him. Exactly, you know.
When he decided, so when he got diagnosed, initially, we had talked about it, and he was like, all right, let's do this thing. Let's take this on, and we're gonna treat this. We're gonna do it. And we went to the oncologist, and we went to the surgeon, and we went to everybody. There were so many appointments, and this was before he announced anything because he wanted to know what this was gonna look like. And we went home after one of the appointments, and we were sitting in his living room, and he said, do you think it's okay if I don't do all of that? Do you think it'll let people down? No, of course not. Because what he wanted for his last days, what he wanted was to be able to see as many people that he cared about as possible. He wanted to see you.
I
He
know.
wanted to see, you know, he wanted to have those phone conversations. Yes, all of them. He wanted that. And treating wasn't going to get him that. Because treating, that's hard. And so he did what might have been, to me, one of the bravest things I've ever seen somebody do. Because when somebody tells you you're dying, your first thing is, we'll fix it. And he said no. He said no. These last months, however many of them I get, are going to be on my terms, with my family, with my friends, with my fans, with the people that I love. So I guess, if anything, a final thought is just thank you for giving him the joy and the drive. You guys kept him going, and he was happy. So thank you.
Unfortunately, you got to get going.
Yeah, sure.
But I just want to say one final thing before we go. George, thank you for being such a huge part of all of our lives. And, we love you, and we miss you, and you're always with us. So, love you, George.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're very healthy.